Great coffee, period.
Listen to podcasts of Joe Walsh and Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. And part of the discussion of the Mueller Report, in addition to poring over the key excerpts, is taking a look back over the last 2 years and seeing how the D.C. press corps' reporting of the investigation holds up to the conclusions offered in Mueller's report, considering, and I am a subscriber to this belief, as Andrew Breitbart offered it, that the press is more powerful than all three branches of government combined, certainly in shaping public opinion. Well, Glenn Greenwald from The Intercept was on with Tucker last night. Here's what he had to say about how the D.C. press corps got so much of this so wrong.
I mean, this is one of the problems, I think, that allowed the media to just go so far off the rails, is that especially those two cable networks, but also even newspapers, pretty much prohibited dissent from ever being heard, so they constantly fed each other these conspiracy theories and told each other that they were on the right track every time they advanced it further, and never really had to confront anybody who questioned or challenged them in any way. I've spent the last 2 years debating everyone I can find who had different views than I had on this whole saga, because I wanted to make certain that the things I was saying were scrutinized and subjected to critical rigor. And that's exactly what they avoided, and that's the reason why they went so far off the rails.
And the reason we shouldn't be surprised by what the Mueller report contains versus so much of what the reporting contained for the last 2 years is because so many of the leading lights in the D.C. press corps said from the outset of Trump's election and inauguration, all the normal rules are suspended. There's so much talk about Trump violating norms. Okay. How about the press corps violating journalistic standards? All that was out the window because it was get Trump at any cost.
Right.
And when you do that, you can end up looking sort of foolish.
If you listen to the media discourse outside of a few circles, they've just put collusion and conspiracy and all of those conspiracy theories they've spent the last 3 years endorsing, just flushed it down the toilet like they don't even exist, and just seamlessly shifted to obstruction, and then they're conflating them to claim essentially that they were right all along. And that is really the alarming thing. I think that in a lot of ways Donald Trump broke the brains of a lot of people, particularly people in the media, who believe that telling lies, inventing conspiracy theories, being journalistically reckless, it's all justified to stop this unparalleled menace. And that's a good thing for an activist to think and a really bad thing for a journalist to think.
I mean, people that I knew were hell-bent on getting Trump on Russian collusion. They thought this is it. This is, a done deal. And they're in shock this morning because they have to process this loss again, too, because there was no there. And I do believe people owe President Trump and the White House apologies.
And I should hasten to add, just on Glenn Greenwald, if you're not familiar with him, even though we've mentioned him a number of times on this show, he is no Trump fan, not an apologist for Trump, thinks he is a corrupt individual, thinks there are a lot of things that surround Trump, particularly his business dealings, which deserve investigation. So this is not somebody flacking for the administration. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Noah Rothman. He's the associate editor of Commentary Magazine, also the author of the book Unjust Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. I almost said unmasking because I'm still thinking about Michael Flynn's unmasking. Unjust Social Justice, the Unmaking of America is Noah Rothman's book. Noah, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, there's so much to cover with respect to the Mueller report, but why don't we start where Glenn Greenwald opined, and that's on the D.C. press corps coverage and their standing 24 hours after the report was released.
Well, Glenn is certainly right to admonish reporters for engaging in activism. He's in perhaps the worst position possible to offer such an admonition, however, because he is about as activist as a reporter comes. Glenn Greenwald, along with people like Laura Poitras, were engaged in working with WikiLeaks very closely during the Manning releases and Edward Snowden releases. This is a gentleman who has a particular agenda and is not shy about cozying up to Moscow when it suits his agenda. The attacks on the press here are sort of half-founded. The context in which these bombshell after bombshell relating to Russia-related stuff was that this is Donald Trump working with Russia, right? that is unfounded. The Mueller report has demonstrated that collusion did not occur pretty definitively.
Right.
However, the notion that the reporting was inaccurate is simply unfounded too. If you read this report, a lot of it is very familiar. We've read all this before. None of this, there are very few bombshells in this report. In fact, most of the citations, when you get down to the footnotes, are the Washington Post, the New York Times, the variety of other, the Wall Street Journal, every mainstream press outlets that were already on this beat. Part of the reason why this report is not shocking is because we know all of this already, and it's because of mainstream reporting.
Well, okay, but we also know there's a lot of things that were treated as bombshells, that were treated as more inclined to be truthful than not, that were not. Carter Page exonerated. The BuzzFeed story about Manafort sharing polling data, that rejected in the Mueller report. There are other, the General Flynn and General Flynn's testimony about an operation to find Hillary's emails that was essentially allegedly in multiple press accounts being orchestrated by the Trump campaign, also rejected, for example.
Yeah, so, 2 out of 3, I'm with you there. The Manafort thing is a little different. So the report there does not allege and cannot establish definitively that there is some prosecutorial context that could be prosecuted involving a conspiracy with a foreign power. That's not to say that it wasn't an effort to do so. It demonstrates pretty clearly that Manafort's effort was to convey information to Viktor Yanukovych, former president of Ukraine, who would convey that information to the Kremlin, very specific about what the chain of custody of that information was going to be and what Manafort's intent was. It doesn't rise to the level of prosecution because they don't think they can prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt in court that it would constitute conspiracy, but they allege that it occurred.
Well, yes, but here's the thing. This is a report from a prosecutor, and so it's seeming in much of the press coverage to have been lost, including as it pertains to Trump and some of his temper tantrum and so forth, is the presumption of innocence upon which our justice system sets. So they allege all sorts of things. They think this happened. It's not a criminal offense. It's not a prosecutorial. It doesn't rise to the level of prosecution, but somehow we're supposed to all say these are bad guys and the bad guy at the top should be taken out of office, which is what Democrats continue to say today.
Yeah, and to some extent, I mean, the DOJ is violating its own policy by even getting this out there. I mean, it sort of they have no choice but to do that because of the public outcry. If they weren't to do that, it would be considered a cover-up. There would be a big public outcry about that. But at the same time, they're releasing all this information about Donald Trump, in which he did things that if people listened to him, he told his subordinates to do a variety of things that the report alleges would constitute obstruction, would be obstructionary if anybody had listened to his orders. A lot of the times he was simply ignored by his subordinates. And so getting that out there is sort of a defamatory context about somebody who's not under prosecution. And that's what James Comey was admonished for when he went after Hillary Clinton and said she did stuff that was reckless. But she's also not being prosecuted. The Department of Justice doesn't just put information about people out there who are not being prosecuted. So in that sense, the president is in a way a victim here, but he is a victim of his own callousness and the political circumstances around the fact that he's the president of the United States.
Well, and also we still have the response document from Rudy G coming out next week, which will ostensibly address some of the contents of the Mueller report. So it's not done from the White House's perspective, at least in terms of that response that's forthcoming.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we don't know. I'm reluctant to prejudge what's in that document because who knows?
Yeah,
but we do know now what's in the Mueller report.
Yeah.
There's part one, the collusion aspect, that's dead and buried.
Right.
The obstruction area is a little bit more murky. It doesn't rise to the level of prosecution, but that's not to say that something untoward didn't occur.
What do you think about Sarah Sanders? Do you think there's a credibility issue there? Because she, we learned yesterday that she lied to the media and said, that James Comey had lost, favor with the rank and file in the FBI. And she said, no, that she made that up and there was no evidence to prove that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, she does have a credibility issue now. Also, why is that in the report?
I don't know.
It's kind of unrelated. And so it makes you think, like, my boss has a good piece on this, John Podhoretz. Mm-hmm. We read the report, and tonally, the report suggests that the people who wrote it were not big fans of the president. To put it mildly. If they could have got this guy, they would have. And it seems like it just wasn't there. Now, the president doesn't come off very good in this report. Sarah Sanders doesn't come up in this report. Good. Donald Trump Jr. comes off horribly. He was working very closely and actively with WikiLeaks, which is a cat's paw of the Russian government, and he was doing as he was told by WikiLeaks. He seems very gullible in this report, and at the very least, an unwitting co-conspirator. But at the same time, there's nothing actionable here. There's nothing criminal. And if the president could have been gotten on something, you get the sense that they would have got him.
Oh, by the way, on the Sarah Sanders matter of Comey having lost faith in the rank and file, we've had former FBI agents on this show, former FBI division heads on this show who said Comey had lost the faith of the rank and file. So it's not like even if she didn't do her homework or legwork like she should have to have specific people that she could reference conversations she had to back up that claim. It's not like that claim is out of bounds. That's a claim that nobody was making. We've heard that claim on this show from former feds.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me either. The way in which James Comey behaved and his admonition by Rod Rosenstein makes it pretty clear that he did behave in a fashion that was out of bounds of what the DOJ is supposed to, how the DOJ is supposed to conduct itself.
Dan Henninger, writing in the Wall Street Journal yesterday after the release of the report, suggested, look, you had FBI, intel agencies, the press corps essentially suggest they were willing to risk losing the faith of at least half the population in pursuit of President Trump. And at the end of the day, based on the contents of that report, it wasn't worth it. And America is left to deal with the rubble in Mueller's wake. How do you respond to that characterization?
No, I think it was worth it. I think it's necessary to put 2016 behind us, and this was a necessary step to do that. In the process, again, my other colleague, Abe Greenwald, made the observation that Donald Trump's election is now probably the most valid and legitimate election in American history. It has been so thoroughly scrutinized that there is really no room for doubt at this point as to how 2016 occurred. And there were elements of doubt in the public imagination, and they needed to be dispelled, and they have now been dispelled to the extent that they exist anymore. They exist as a conspiracy theory. Obstruction, again, consists of the president's poor behavior and his sordid impulses, and the fact that nobody listened to him when he was demanding that these actions be taken on his behalf to subvert the conduct of justice. Thank God the president is surrounded by people with a little bit more foresight and the instincts for self-preservation than perhaps he has. But again, this doesn't rise to the level of prosecution, so the issue is pretty much open and shut.
What about going back to the idea of finally closing the book on 2016? It seems like maybe there's a reason not to close the book on 2016 as it pertains to Hillary Clinton and the last days of the Obama administration. We still know there was one crime committed. That was the unmasking of General Flynn, for which no one has been held accountable, in addition to the curious decision-making of Comey and others, as well as the pending Inspector General report from DOJ Inspector General Horowitz that's coming out about McCabe and senior leadership at FBI. Do you think Barr should pursue a fresh look at 2016 from the perspective of both of the investigations and the decision-making that was made at the highest levels of these agencies and the Obama cabinet?
Yes, I do, and for the same reason, and understanding that it will be politically detrimental to Republicans. I don't think anything happened. I think unmasking was a genuine crime. Everything else that occurred that it haunts the imagination of Donald Trump's defenders, the notion that this was the genesis of this investigation was untoward, I don't think there's much to support that. But I don't know for sure, and I think we need to have an investigation into that in order to know for sure. But Republicans will risk investigation fatigue at that point. They risk, just as Democrats, if they were to harp on this, pursue impeachment over this report, will be to risk appearing myopic and obsessive. Republicans could too, in the absence of some sort of a smoking gun, which I don't think is there. So the public imagination needs to be satisfied. They need to know what happened in 2016 so we can put it behind them. But I don't think a lot of people are really interested in these investigations spilling over into the 2020 cycle. I think everybody really does want 2016 to be behind them. So there's a political risk there, even if good governance demands it.
He is Noah Rothman, Associate Editor for Commentary, author of the book Unjust Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. Noah, thanks for joining us as always. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560.